40 years ago, in 2 months, I was hired by the state of California to be a state park ranger. And I worked up in the Redwoods in that early part of my career, and then later on we were back up there for a while. And I was working the night watch with my partner, Ranger Jack Hanks. And Jack was a seasoned LAPD lieutenant. He had retired from police work and moved his family up into the Redwoods of extreme Northern California where we were. And after a short time, he decided to hire himself on as a summer ranger to do the patrol of the parks. And they paired me as the rookie with Ranger Hanks. Now, we had been plagued at Humboldt Redwood State Park with car burglaries all summer long. And it was a crime of opportunity where someone would come along into one of the parking lots as people are down on the river swimming or whatnot, picnicking off in the woods. And they would grab a big rock nearby, smash a window, and grab whatever wallets or purses or cameras were visible, and they would flee. So one night, the night before our shift started, the burglars had hit a family from New Jersey and just wiped them out, took everything out of their car. And so they had no money and were pretty much destitute on the opposite side of the country from where they lived. And they still had to drive all the way back home. So the Rangers passed the hat and collected some money enough to get them to Eureka for the Traveler's Aid to help them. And so I'm working that night watch with Jack, and we come in, and he says, "We're going to catch those individuals tonight." And I said, "Whatever you say, Jack." Right? I was the rookie. And so within 15 minutes, Jack and I, Jack, had identified the vehicle they were going to break into, and we had identified the burglars who were casing the car, driving back and forth on the Avenue of the Giants. And so Jack said, "Drop me off at this tree and go down the road a quarter of a mile." And he had the portable radio, and I had the radio in the truck. And a few minutes later, he says, "Yeah, they drove back. They've parked. They're about 100 feet from the mark, and they're walking up the road. They picked up a big rock. They hit the car. They hit the car. Come on in." So I came swooping in, and I parked the patrol truck, blocking their car so they couldn't get away in their vehicle. And then I ran down the road to where Jack was with hollering at the bad guys. Now, they were Humboldt County homegrown mountain boys, and they were loggers in their blood and could scale mountains and trees with no problem at all. And I was in the best shape of my life. I was, 22 years old, right out of a police academy. I could run, but there was no way I was going to catch these guys. So I hollered up. They were on the Avenue of the Giants, was where the burglary took place. They were running up the embankment up to the Redwood Highway, Highway 101 that goes north and south. And I hollered up, "You're under arrest, come down here." And one of these two knuckleheads actually came down, right? There was no way I'd ever caught them. But one of them came down. Now, I remember his name and the circumstance to this day, but because it's recorded and it'll be on the internet, I won't mention his name, but I'll just call him Johnny Be Good, because believe it or not, his name was kind of like that, okay? And Johnny Be Good said, once he realized, oh, wait a minute, what have I just done? He said, "I'm going to fight you." And he put up his dukes, and I reached for my baton, and it was in the truck. So I said, okay, let's bring it on. And he realized, I was actually about a foot taller than him. He was kind of a little guy. And he says, okay, I'm going to run. And he started running, and that I could do, right? Even in my hiking boots, I could run after him. So my supervisor had shown up by that time, and I just kind of ran him up onto the hood of the patrol car and arrested him. And all of these things went swimming through my head at that moment, because suddenly I was somebody who I wasn't in that moment before, right? I had the authority, I had the badge, I had the training, I had the ranger hat, I had all the equipment, but I had never crossed that line and made an arrest. And that was my first. And I was thinking, I should be helping this guy. And I thought, what am I thinking? I am helping him. I'm going to help him right into the jail, and maybe he'll get his life straightened out, right? I'm helping the victims that he's been burgling all summer long. So, now the rest of this story is that 20 years later, I was a supervising ranger in Mendocino County. Now, this mountain boy was from the little tiny truck farm town of Shively. There's about 100 people that live there. Very remote, one of the most remote places in California. And we were interviewing a maintenance worker for a park that I was at, and he was from Shively. So I asked him, do you know Johnny Be Good? And he said, why, are you the ranger that arrested him? And I said, why, yes, I am. And he said, that was the best thing that ever happened to him in his life. So I felt really good 20 years later that, here I was all concerned about that aspect of my job and my life, and I came to understand that it's actually very positive. Now, I learned in that very first arrest very quickly that you don't just arrest someone and lock them up and throw away the key, right? No, they have to be prosecuted, and they're either found guilty or they're acquitted, found innocent. And so every crime I've found has elements. In the case of the car burglar, it's pretty simple. You break into a car that's not yours without the owner's permission for the purpose of committing some kind of crime. Okay? In this case, it was theft. They were stealing things. 4 simple elements. And as the officer, I had to present in my report the evidence that supported each one of the elements of that crime. It was simple. The means to accomplish it was preserved. It was a big old rock. We put it in a paper bag and marked on what was in it, and I sealed it with evidence tape and wrote my name on it, so if the seal was broken, then that would taint the evidence, so we could go into court with a sealed bag, right? That pretty much shows the intent to burgle, right? Big old rock through the broken window, right? And the other evidence would be the testimony of the victim. Yeah, I never knew that guy. It's my car. He didn't have permission to be there, right? The testimony of Ranger Hanks, who witnessed the burglary, that they had parked down the road and everything. So we packaged up this evidence, if you will, in a report, and it's the prosecutor's job to convince the jury that the crime occurred and that the accused is the one that did it. Well, Johnny Be Good actually was convicted and did some jail time. And it was, according to Greg Bartlett, the best thing that ever happened to him. But it was a simple case, right? It was just 4 elements. It was real simple. Years later, I was working at Folsom Lake State Recreation Area. We were plagued by car burglaries. We had 68 burglaries one summer. And so my supervisor put me on the trail, and one of my other partners up in Auburn arrested the perpetrator. and I put the case together. And I had 68 cars broken into. Each car had 2 or 3 or 5 victims who lost property in the car. And so there's that many more witnesses. So I had literally thousands of pieces of evidence. We had to take up over a whole warehouse once we were all done with all of our evidence. And we had a couple hundred witnesses that we had to interview. And now we took that to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor tried to present that overwhelming amount of evidence and witness statements, victim statements, to the court. The court would be befuddled, right? A jury would just be overwhelmed by all of that. And so the prosecutor will take specific cases, or specific pieces of the case, to present to the jury in the best format the prosecutor thinks possible in order to convince the jury. Now, y'all didn't come here to listen about my ranger stories or listen about police procedure. So let's turn to the Gospel of John, and we're going to start studying John's Gospel today, but we're going to start it at the end. So go to chapter 20 of John and verse 30. So John is writing his concluding statement about his gospel here, and he says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." The other 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels. And I'm really looking forward to seeing Scott take us through Matthew's Gospel. They are a synopsis, generally a chronology of Jesus' life, from the beginning when he was born until his crucifixion and resurrection and ascension, and all of the events as a biography that happened in that time period. But John is very different, and he does not write a chronology. John is presenting to the jury, the jury, a legal case about Jesus and who he is, to convince the jury that Jesus is the Son of God. John pulls out very specific pieces of evidence that he calls signs. Okay? Changing the water to wine, healing the nobleman's son, feeding 5,000, healing the man at the pool of Bethesda, walking on the water, and Peter's experience with that, healing the man who was born blind, raising Lazarus. These are all pieces of evidence that John puts together. Sometimes they're not in the chronological order that they occurred in, but they're put in his methodology to present that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Nicodemus came to Jesus in chapter 3, and he noted, "Rabbi, we know that you are the teacher that has come from God. For no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." So the Jews saw the signs that Jesus was performing, and they realized that he had to be from God. Right? This is the Pharisees who are seeing this and understanding that he is from God. But the Jews saw the signs as a series of unrelated supernatural events, never connecting the dots. Right? They look at each one as if it was an isolated event. Okay, so the next time Jesus talks, they say, "Well, give us a sign." But they forget about all the 40 other signs he did the day before. right? So John gives us very specific pieces of evidence. He gives us very specific statements from witnesses. He's going to start with John the Baptist, right? Later on, he'll talk about Nicodemus, and we'll hear the testimony of the woman at the well, and we'll hear Peter's statements, right? And then John will give us very specific statements from the accused, from Jesus himself, right? Now, I found something a few years ago. John is overwhelmingly taking place around the 7 feasts of Israel. There's 879 verses in John. No, I didn't count them, but I have it on a reliable source. 879 verses in John, and 660 of them are directly related to the events surrounding one of Israel's 7 feasts. Now, that's not something that we as Gentiles would typically think about as we study the Word. The 7 feasts I'm not going to go into detail with now, but we will be talking about elements of each one, bless you, as we study John. But they're the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of the First Fruits. Now, all 3 of those occur one right after the other during a week's period of time. And often in the Gospels, in all of the Gospels, it talks about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it encompasses Passover, unleavened bread, and the Feast of the First Fruits. And then later on, there's a standalone that's related to those called the Feast of Weeks. And then later on in the fall, there is the Feast of Trumpets. The Jews now call that Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, or Jewish New Year. And then that's followed by Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is followed by the Feast of Booths, which is the restoration of all things. And those 3 occur in a short period of time in the fall. So 3 times each year, Jewish men were called to come to Jerusalem. In the spring for Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. During the summer for the Feast of Weeks, and then during the fall for the last 3. And Jesus, as a good Jew, attended those. And many of the events that John records are directly related to those where Jesus is showing that he is the fulfillment. He brings fullness to the messianic prophecies in each feast. And we'll be able to look at John's evidence for that. So John said Jesus did a whole lot more things, right, that he could have used. But he's making the case, and it's a perfect case, to present that Jesus brings fullness to all that the Old Testament talks about Messiah. And he could have brought in probably thousands of pieces of evidence for us and thousands of witness statements, and yet it would have overwhelmed us. So he carefully crafts a case to convince the jury of a very specific thing. Again, in John 20, verse 30, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So those signs and witness statements that John records here are presented to fulfill 2 purposes. One is to believe. The Greek word is pisteuo, and it means to believe. John desperately wants us to believe. John uses pisteuo 98 times in his gospel. Matthew used it 11 times. Mark used it 14 times. John used it about 9 times. John uses it 98 times. He's not just giving us a story of Jesus' life. He is presenting a case so that we will believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And not only that we would, once believed, would have life. So let's look at John's opening arguments in chapter 1 and verse 1. Now let's read the first 18 verses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that has been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He's referring to John the Baptist here. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in the name of in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of a man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.' For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." We'll stop there. In his opening statement here, John doesn't take us to the manger that the other Gospels do. He takes us to Genesis 1:1, all the way back to the beginning, to show us the eternality of the Word. He talks about the Word, the life, the light, the Son. Later on in chapter 1, he's going to talk about Messiah and the King and the Son of Man and things like the Lamb, relating Jesus to those things. But right now he's talking specifically about the eternality of Jesus, who he was in eternity past and who he became at the present time. So he opens with a direct reference to the eternal existence of Jesus rather than when he appeared on earth. Right? And he calls Jesus the Logos. I discovered that Aristotle in the 4th century BC, and before him a philosopher named Heracles, these people in Greek history noted that the Logos, the Word, was the way they described the governing principle behind the things in the universe. These Greek philosophers understood that there was some kind of presence beyond their existence and their awareness that held things together, that created things, that made all things work. So by the time Jesus comes on the scene, and John writes his gospel that's deeply entrenched in the Greco-Roman culture around the Mediterranean in the Middle East. And so John, like Paul, is drawing on something that is already embedded in the cultural awareness, the logos. The Jews use the term memre for the same principle, that God in his creative and expressive self spoke a word, memre, and that created. So, we have the overpowering, overwhelming presence in the universe that gives definition to the universe. And John is saying that is Jesus. The Word was with God. In fact, the Word was God. And he's going to use two more words to contrast what Jesus has always been with what he became. The first one is just a simple word of in. It means to be or had been, or in many of our English translations, was. The Word was God, was with God. The Word was God. Right? Theos en ha logos. The Word was God. Right? His divine nature and pre-existence is seen here. Jesus was before anything else was. But he became. Okay? It's the Greek word ginomai. That's a zatdu. He became the Son of God. In verse 14, it says, and the Word became flesh. So the Word, the overpowering presence of God in the universe that holds everything together, became flesh. He became a man in that instant. Right? So God is going to build, or John is going to build the case here for Jesus' eternal nature and his humanity, beginning here in verse 1 through 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that has been made. Right? That's different than the synoptic gospels that start in the manger. Right? Jesus of Nazareth, who went up to Jerusalem 3 times a year from the time he was probably 13 years old until his death, 3 times a year he would go up to Jerusalem with the other Jewish men to celebrate the feasts, right? Jesus, the one who healed the lame and gave sight to the blind and cleansed the lepers and raised people from the dead and addressed people with the authority of God that no one could speak to. He is the God who is inhabited in eternity past. So every account and each word and each miraculous activity that John presents to us as evidence in his gospel must be weighed in light of this eternal opening statement. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was before creation. The Word was beside the Father. And actually, we'll talk about that in a minute. It actually means in the Father's bosom, and we'll talk about how precious that is. The Word was the visible presence of the triune God. The Word is the Creator. All of these things have to be taken in light of this opening statement that the Word was with God and the Word was God. The Word was before creation because He was the Creator, and then He became man. Verse 4. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Jesus said later on that we'll see, I am the light of the world. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. John's going to give us those statements of the accused, and that's shoring up John's opening argument here, that Jesus is the light of the world, and He is the generator and the author of life. And light and life exist in the person of Jesus. And He gives us the beginnings. He introduces the first witness here of John the Baptist. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through Him. Yet the world did not know Him. He came to His own, and His own people did not receive Him. The world that He created did not know Him. I would think that would be among the most depressing things you could imagine. That here is the creation, the thinking men and women that bear your image don't even recognize you. And then it gets worse, where the people that were His own, from His own collective group, they shared His physical DNA, right? As Jews, they rejected Him. They did not receive Him. Verse 12. But to all who did receive Him, there's a great but. To all who did receive Him, who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of a man, but of God. This points to our present relationship with the eternal Jesus. Right? We are adopted as His children, but we are naturally born by God in that He has given us His spiritual DNA by way of His Holy Spirit that mingles with our own spirit and testifies that we are His children. So we are not just adopted as children, but we are also remade, reborn as God's natural children. Now contrast the world's response to the incarnation with the believer's response here in verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, glory as of the only Son with the Father, full of grace and truth. Right? John is responding to Jesus. We have seen His glory. The rest of the world saw it and went, what the heck was that? Right? And the Jews saw it and went, wait a minute. That is not the Messiah that we learned about in Sabbath school. Right? He is not taking on Rome and kicking them out militarily. What is going on here with this guy? But John says, we saw His glory. And in fact, John describes it. It's the glory as if He was from the Father, because he is. In verse 15, John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me,' because he was before me." You know, Jesus was born after John the Baptist, right? They were cousins, and yet John the Baptist says he was before me. John, we know, understood who Jesus was. In fact, John the Baptist is the first one to give an amen in the womb. You know, when Mary shows up at Elizabeth's house, John is like, "Yes, my Savior is in there," right? And I'm not even born yet. And verse 16. "For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace upon grace upon grace." No matter what roadblock you want to throw in there, and how miserable the weather was that I experienced in California, or how bitter cold it was here, or how much snow there is here, right? He is still lavishing us with grace upon grace upon grace. "For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." Grace instead of grace is actually how that translates in the Greek. We want to just say it's heaping grace upon grace, but it's here's the grace. You take that grace away and put grace in instead of it. You take that grace away and put grace in instead of it. No matter when you try and take that grace away, grace is always going to replace it, is what that means. I really liked this reference to Moses here, because in the system that Moses inaugurated, no one could see God. But now, right, fullness has been brought to that system, the law, in the person of Jesus. Let's look at verse 18. "No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side has made him known." I want to read that from the New American Standard now, because I really like how they translate this out. "No man has seen God at any time." Now keep in mind, we want to think that Moses saw God, but God said, "If you see me, you will die, because I am so glorious," right? So he hid Moses in that cleft of the rock, in that crack, and put his hand over as he passed by. God's probably got this really big hand or something, right? And so Moses could see the radiance, the Shekinah glory of God without looking on his person, and that reflected back in Moses. "No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." I got really excited when I was finishing my notes last night, and I shared this with Margaret. And she said, "If you use this, you have to tell them this is the $1 million word, right? You won't remember this word. It may make sense to some and it may not to others, so I'm going to try and explain it, right? He has explained him. The only begotten God, that is Jesus, the only begotten Son, right? Who is in the bosom of the Father. What a precious discussion about Jesus being in the Father in his heart of hearts. Right? He has explained him. And the Greek word for explained, some translations say he has made him known. It's exegeomai. Okay? It's a big, long, $1 million word. Right? Theologians get from that word the word exegete. Okay? A Bible teacher's call is to exegete the Scriptures, to draw out of Scriptures those things that are hard to understand and maybe even impossible to know without a Spirit-led interpretation. Right? A Bible teacher does not want to eisegete. That's to put into the text stuff that isn't there. We want to exegete, take out from the text to communicate what the text is saying. That's what Jesus does. The person of Jesus draws out from God the Father to reveal and communicate who God is. God's very nature is explained by Jesus, by his actions, by his words, by all the signs he does. Who Jesus is exegetes God. It draws out who God is. And all of this really speaks to the tender nature of who God is, right? Made known through Jesus, who is the Lamb of God. And that's where we'll stop it today as we move into John. But I wanted us to see the opening statement that John makes as he begins to prepare his case. And he's concluding his opening statement here by explaining who the Word is. The defining principle of the universe is the Logos, and that is Jesus. And in fact, Jesus resides eternally in the bosom of the Father and exegetes or draws out from the Father who he is in the person of Jesus. So let's close in prayer.